Hi, I'm Barry Huff. Welcome back to another podcast on the Lord's Prayer. A Sunday school teacher asked a student to say one of the names the Bible uses for God. The student said, Harold. The teacher was puzzled and said, "Why do you think God's name is Harold?" He replied, "It's in the prayer. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." For all you heralds out there, tough luck. The prayer is actually, hallowed be thy name. Have you ever thought that when you're praying the Lord's Prayer, you're actually commanding for something to be done? I was surprised to learn that the verb hallowed, like most of the Greek verbs in the Lord's Prayer, is actually an imperative, a command, which encourages me to approach this prayer with a greater sense of conviction, authority, and bold expectation that what I'm praying will be and is being done. In fact, Mary Baker Eddy takes the commands a step further in her spiritual interpretation of the Lord's Prayer, and interprets them not as requests for God's name to be hallowed, but as affirmations that God's name is hallowed, as the adorable one, and God's kingdom is come. In the chapter on prayer in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, Mary Baker Eddy describes Jesus' prayers as deep and conscientious protests of truth. So as we're praying these commands in the Lord's Prayer, we too can pray them as deep and conscientious protests of truth. Let God's name be hallowed. But what does it mean to hallow God's name? The Greek verb translated as hallowed means to set apart as sacred, to make or treat something as holy. This is the reverence that we can have for God's name. In Judaism, God's name Yahweh is seen as so holy that it's not even spoken. This is so interesting because the Lord's Prayer unites the hallowing of God's sacred name with the more familiar name, Abba, Father, Dad, showing our close relationship with Almighty God. Throughout the Bible, one's name means one's nature, so hallowing God's name means actually standing in awe of God. This fulfills the third commandment about not taking God's name in vain. In fact, hallowing the name was a phrase often used to describe obeying God's commandments. But who's supposed to do this hallowing? Is it God or us? The first three verbs in the prayer, let your name be hallowed, let your kingdom come, and let your will be done, are often described as divine passives, which means that God is the one who's supposed to do the action, that God will bring honor to God's name by establishing his kingdom and accomplishing her will on earth. But the prayer doesn't leave us off the hook, because in the Old Testament we also see people hallowing God's name. So the answer is probably both. We're praying for God to hallow God's name, but we're also praying for God to give us the strength, commitment, and inspiration to stand in awe of God, to manifest God's kingdom in our actions, to do God's will. A list of the sources I used when preparing these podcasts can be found on tmcyouth.com.
This podcast is produced and copyrighted by the First Church of Christ Scientists in Boston.